welcome to this week's episode of the Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Very, very much appreciated. Had a nice email from the distillery. They seem to be quite happy with the review. Whether they'll actually use it on social media, I have no idea. But anyway, at least everybody was happy, which is cool. So on to today's episode of the show. I guess today's episode of the show is kind of interesting insofar that it's kind of set against a backdrop of difficult trading, shall we say. Bear with me and I will explain. I will get to the point. Basically, in the news this week, the Irish distillers have announced that they're halting or sort of having a pause on production at Middleton, I think from sort of spring to sort of midsummer or something like that. Now, in essence, in every day, you wouldn't normally sort of worry about that. I mean, distilleries have quiet periods for all manner of reasons, mainly sort of maintenance, that kind of thing. But it kind of comes set against, like I said, the backdrop of slowing sales. We all know that, you know, our spare cash is being squeezed. I mean, you know, the bills are going up left, right and centre. I mean, I don't know about you, but sort of Nottingham Council are putting their council tax up by the maximum possible amount yet again. Normally, or for years, they've been complaining about the fact they're not getting enough money from central government, but we all know it's actually more down to mismanagement than anything else, which is why they went bust. But anyway, that's not for a whiskey show to sort of go on about. But anyway, it's a big wake-up call really for the whiskey industry, in the fact that there is now, I mean, there are some people who've been going on about huge whiskey lakes and all this kind of stuff, but whether that's true, difficult to say. But there's obviously sort of a supply and demand issue going on here. And although I don't think we're in the mid-1980s, I don't think we're going to sort of see wholesale distillery closures and that kind of thing, because obviously whiskey is still sort of a very viable business. I think we're going to start to see a lot more sort of like of these kind of production breaks. Certainly I believe Glen has been mothballed, and I think there'll probably be a few more other of these slightly smaller, sort of more esoteric, shall we say, distilleries that will be mothballed over the coming sort of few months, I would imagine. Certainly, unless we get some good news on the economy and things start to pick up and we all feel maybe not necessarily have more money in our pocket, but at least feel that we have a bit more money in our pocket. I still think sort of it's going to be a difficult trading time. But now I think this might be a bit of a flight of fancy, but this may well actually sort of benefit people like who I'm looking at today. I'm looking at an independent bottling company called Campbeltown Whisky Company, and this is a company that releases a series of malts under the name of Watt Whisky. Now, I mean, this may well actually help the independent sector, because it may well force some distilleries that have actually withdrawn from the secondary market to start to look at actually reselling casks again. Now, I know from talking to sort of people in the industry that the bulk whiskey market is basically booming at the moment. I mean, you know, there are players in that market that never used to do it, and it's all being shipped out to the Far East and what have you. Now, you can see why a lot of distilleries are doing this, because nobody gets to hear about it. It's not being bottled as a distillery bottling down there. It's all being sort of tankered away. Nobody knows about it. It doesn't ruin the image that they have crafted for their specific distilleries. But I think the point being is that there's going to be a case where money talks at the end of the day, and I think that not only they're going to have to do that, but they may well start looking, like I said, back at the secondary market, selling off some casks to the independents, and that may well benefit everybody, because we might actually see a bit of a bigger gene pool to pick from. You know, that would be really nice, other than, oh look, it's yet another Blair Athol kind of thing. Or, oh look, it's yet another Blair Athol that's been finished in a funky wine cask. You know, you see where I'm coming from? We might actually start to see a bit more, some different casks appearing, shall we say, which is really cool. But anyway, back to today's episode of the show. Like I said, I had a lovely email from Mark a month or two ago now, sort of, introducing himself and his bottlings. And obviously I'd heard of Mark through sort of and his bottlings through other channels, shall we say, other customers of mine that had obviously sort of mentioned some of the things that he was doing. So I thought it was quite nice, and we got some samples, and I thought, yeah, let's do an episode of the show. So basically the company was founded by husband and wife Mark and Kate Watt. Mark had started his career, for want of a better word, at the Craigalackie Hotel in 1998 before moving on to Duncan Taylor for 7 years, and then Cadenheads for a further 8 years. Kate was working at Springbank, or had been for a number of years, before moving to Glen, and then like I said, the two of them sort of had that kind of, well, why don't we sort of set up our own independent bottling company, which they did in December of 2019. Obviously nobody knew that the impending issues with COVID and lockdown and all that kind of thing was going to happen, to make things incredibly challenging. But some companies obviously sort of went under because of that, but obviously Mark and his independent bottlings didn't do that, and which is really cool. Basically they crowdfunded their first cask release, which I believe was in April of 2000, and a few months later they released a second cask, or 5 casks in actual fact, to the sort of like the general public, and they've carried on doing so, and have now racked up to date around about 100 or so bottlings. So yeah, it's looking good. I mean, and like I said, if they're able to sort of source some more, different types of casks and things like that, I'm not just talking about obviously Mark, but I'm talking, like I said, about the independent sector as a whole. I think that's going to be sort of really good. We could see a bit of a renaissance, shall we say. Now, coming back to Mark's whiskies, they are obviously mainly bottled at natural cask strength, unless they're a little bit on the high side, in which case they sort of cut the ABV down to 57.1%. And when I got sent the samples, I wondered whether that was just an anomaly, or whether that was a deliberately chosen ABV, which apparently it is. Now, the reasoning for that is that sort of both of them are very much into things like the Macallan 10-year-old 100 proof, the old 100 proof Springbank, which of course is 57.1%. And so, they thought that, if it's a bit on the high side, if it's a bit too intense, sort of 60-odd% ABV, and that's not unusual for young whiskies, it has to be said, they would cut it down to 57.1. So I think there's a few of them in today's lineup that are at that ABV. So yeah, essentially that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Apart from one other really quite interesting thing, the labels. Now, as you know, I'm quite into labels, and I noticed that the company were using a colour coding system, which is not unheard of. I mean, pretty much, well, I wouldn't say all independent bottlers, but a number of independent bottlers will use some form of colour coding. Mainly they use the colour coding for the region of the whisky, so things like red for Speyside, blue for Islay, that kind of stuff. Not quite with Mark's whiskies. You see, Mark has a condition, which I hope I pronounced this correctly, synesthesia, which basically means he smells in colour, which is quite unusual, as to be said. I can see where that kind of comes from. I mean, I wouldn't say that I smell in colour at all, but there are times when you smell and you taste a whiskey, you do get this colour feeling, and it's normally linked to fruit. I mean, I normally get, you normally get sort of red fruits, or yellow fruits, or green fruits, or things like that, and then you get grassy notes and citric notes, and it does kind of have a colour feeling. Now, I won't pretend to be sort of suffering from that type of condition, but basically, when obviously Mark sort of noses a particular whiskey and gets this kind of colour, that is what the colour of the logo and the labelling on the bottle turns out. Now, I don't as he said on the website, or maybe I think it was Kate that sort of said it, I don't know, whether that's actually sort of just completely and utterly random, and that means all the bottlings are going to be random. I mean, you look at the two rums, and one's a blue, one's got a bluey label, one's got a green label. So whether this is going to feed into a sort of a stylistic sort of colour coding, or whether it's going to carry on being completely and utterly random, nobody knows. But it's, I think it's, you know, it's a nice little sort of tidbit. I think it might not be sort of you know, widely known about that, but I think it gives it gives you a kind of like a sort of like, I wouldn't not as, it gives it a human angle, I think, and I think sometimes that's what's missing in whiskey. We have these huge global corporations that own sort of vast distilleries and all that kind of thing, and sometimes you just feel there's a disconnect between you or me as the purchaser of the whiskey and the, you know, the company that sort of bottles it. You know, I mean, yeah, unless you obviously know somebody that works for Diageo, you buy a bottle of Lagavulin and it's just purely a financial transaction, but when you're buying a sort of a bottle from an independent bottling company, they're often sort of owned by individuals. You just feel there's a little bit more of a connection, and when you know things like this, it makes the whole thing feel a little bit more human, I think. So anyway, so I think that's enough waffling. Like I said, I've got sort of half a dozen spirits in front of me. Like I said, there's a couple of rums at the end, which I'm really looking forward to tasting. They're all sort of, you know, going to require a bit of dilution, I believe. So I think it's just time to introduce the lineup. Right, okay, so now I think these are all individual cask bottlings. I must admit, that was one thing I just didn't ask, because the information didn't get sent with cask numbers and all that kind of stuff. Some bottling companies don't actually bother using them, but anyway. So the first bottling we'll be looking at is been distilled at a Speyside distillery, so another one of those wonderful unnamed casks. It's a 15-year-old bourbon hogshead, bottled at 54.9%. It was distilled in 2009 and bottled in 2024. Number 2 is an 11-year-old Glen Moray. This is an Oloroso Hoggy. It was distilled in 2008, bottled last year at 54.6%. Bottling number 3 is called Peat Smoke on Gorgie blended Scotch whiskey, 5-year-old, and bottled at 57.1%. Who Gorgie or Georgie, or however you pronounce that, is, I have absolutely no idea, and I don't know whether Mark has vatted this himself, but he's given me the components of it, so I'm probably guessing that he may well have done it. It's a blend of 42% 5-year-old peated blended malt, so that was already the pre-blended bit of the malt equation, and then it was vatted with a 58% 12-year-old North British grain, and that was bottled in 2023. Bottling number 4 is a Loch Lomond. It's a 6-year-old Croftengea. It's bottled at 57.1%, so I mean that was probably, I would guess, a 6-year-old Croftengea, probably somewhere up in about sort of 58 to sort of 60% ABV. It's a single I'm assuming it's a single bourbon barrel. It's been aged in a bourbon barrel, and it was bottled in 2023. And then finally we're moving on to 2 of the rums. The first is a Guyanese rum. It's 12 years old and probably from Diamond, I think. It's interesting that it carries what's the word for it? A sort of not pseudonym. It's the wrong word, but a kind of it's MBD2M, which is, I think it's a cask mark or a sort of maker's mark or something like that, and I think that gives you the clue to the sort of like the distillery. I have seen it before. I think actually, where did I see it last? Dram, I think, did a couple of rum bottlings that were labelled exactly the same way. So apparently this has spent 5 years tropical aging, 7 years continental. It was aged in a whiskey barrel, interestingly enough, and bottled again at 57.1%, their favoured ABV. So, like I said, Guyanese, Diamond, probably, can't think of it. one of the other, well, I think I'm pretty much the only one in Guyana now, isn't it? Anyway, so that's that one. And the final rum is from Trinidad, and that's a TML Trinidadian rum, which I think is probably going to be Trinidad Distillers, who bottle Angostura. Again, bottled at 57.1%. This spent 8 years aging in the tropics and then 8 years on the continent, probably in Scotland. It's a refill bourbon barrel and was again bottled in 2023. So interesting array of whiskies to, or spirits I should say, to take a look at. So let's kick off with the Unknown Speyside. Okay, so let's see what 15-year-old Speyside gives us then, shall we? That's pleasant. Quite malty, sort of baked bread. Not quite so, not doughy as in the sort of Ben Nevisy kind of doughiness, but it's got a maltiness. There's some gooseberry, grass, a little industrial barley kind of coming through. It's the sort of thing that it's probably a distillery that doesn't bottle wholly in American oak and uses it as a component, possibly. I certainly don't get Glen Farkless. It's possibly, I don't know, it might be sort of Mortlach, Macallan, maybe, that kind of thing. There is that slight edginess there, that slight sort of industrial note that would imply the use of sherry somewhere down the line. But yeah, okay, so as Speyside whisky, yeah, it certainly ticks all the Speyside boxes of that sort of slightly robust sort of style of Spey. Let's see what the power's like. Again, classically Spey on the palate. Again, green apple, gooseberry, so I'm getting green. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to agree with Mark, because I think the logo on that one is red. But yeah, so I'm getting green apple, gooseberry, citrus. Again, there's a hardness of the barley there, which kind of does lead me to sort of think this is probably, it would have ended up being sort of part of a blend with a fair amount of sherry. It's a bit masked, there's a bit of wood smoke on the finish. Let's put a little drop of water with it. Okay, it's a little bit sweeter now on the nose. There's a little bit of honey coming out. It's kind of got that sort of lighter sort of white fruit kind of coming through now. It's not quite so edgy, not quite so sort of industrial. Citric notes have dropped off quite a bit, a little bit of milkiness. Yeah, I mean, it's pleasant. Let's see what the power's like. Again, softer, a little bit more sweetness to the barley, less of the industrial note, simpler, I would say. Again, green fruit on the finish, that gooseberry note is kind of coming through, with a sort of slightly herbal green note as well. It does what it says on the tin. It's a 15-year-old Speyside. Doesn't taste quite as old as 15, or doesn't come across quite so old, so it does come across a little bit younger, but you know, it's not too shabby. Okay, so let's move on to the 11-year-old Glen Moray. So Oloroso Hoggy, not too dark, so maybe not too much in the way of Oloroso. No, it's got obviously some noticeable Oloroso character, although it's you know, it kind of comes across more like it's been aged in a refill cask, because it's got that lightness of dried fruit, the sort of more sultana and dried citrus, a little bit of herbal notes. There's a touch of burnt biscuits. There's a little bit of an astringency there. There's a little bit of green fruit again, you know, definitely Spey in character. Yeah, I'm not kind of, I mean, it's okay. Again, it's that slight burnt biscuit note that's sort of just you know, irritating a little bit. But aside from that, I mean, I know Glen Moray can be a bit variable at times, but I think overall, I think for a sherry hoggy or an Oloroso hoggy, I think it's fairly well balanced actually. Anyway, let's see what the pass like. that is quite astringent. There's a lot of green fruit going on there. I mean, the alcohol is certainly emphasising that as well, because it's masking the finish and it's emphasising those sort of like green fruit notes. Green apple again, but I'm not getting so much gooseberry. It's got that slight herbal oloroso note coming through, a little bit of dried fruit, some citrus, lemon. There's a little bit of vanilla, a little bit of sugar. But it's that overriding sort of citric, astringent sort of character that's the sort of like the main focus of this at the moment. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see whether that actually just takes some of the edge off that astringency. Let's see what the nose gives us now. More spirit character, more biscuity, not quite so much burnt biscuits now, more sort of malted biscuits, that kind of thing. Again, soft, very much in a refill kind of sherry kind of character. Yeah, okay. I mean, it's a pleasant nose. Let's see what the pal's like. That's nice, actually. That is not what I was expecting. It's almost kind of tropical now. The sherry is really kind of sort of dissipated, not that there was a huge amount there to sort of start with. There's some lovely rounded vanilla notes, a little bit of white chocolate, some sherried spice. It's a lot longer, it's less astringent, it's less green, it's fuller. Yeah, I like that palate. That was I wasn't expecting that. I wasn't expecting it to kind of open quite so well. I was expecting maybe some of that sort of like astringency to sort of continue, but it's changed quite dramatically. So with a little drop of water, yeah, I think I prefer that one with a little drop of water, I should say.
Truth is untold, the lies will soon surface.
Right, okay, so let's move on to the peat smoke on Gorgie. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, can we? Okay, that's got a nice maltiness. Again, I'm getting burnt biscuits and citrus. We seem to have a bit of a correlation going on here. There's some gooseberry, some green apple. It's got an astringent sort of spey note kind of nose, and I'm guessing that there's not a lot of Isla in the peated malt blend, because there's a little medicinal. No, it's not medicinal. It's herbal, not medicinal. There's a bit of a nice crisp grain note. I mean, you know, North British does tend to be more in the sort of higher tone, crisper, sort of fresher end of the grain whisky spectrum. A little bit of banana, a little bit of apricot. Yeah, okay. It's not too bad. It's well put together. Not the burnt biscuit note again is kind of a little bit irritating, but yeah, it's not too bad for a 5-year-old blended whisky. It has to be said. Let's do it past like. Now we're more Highland-esque on the palate now, getting that quite herbal, heathery style of Highland peat. Some nice vanillins, a little bit of an astringent note kind of coming through. There's a bit of bitter spice, tar certainly on the finish, toffee, a little bit of coconut. The grain is adding that nice little nip. I think it all depends on how much that would retail for, and I must admit I didn't sort of look that one up, it has to be said. But you know, again, 5-year-old blend. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing with sort of blended whiskey, that because you have to put the lowest age statement on the label, if you're going to put an age statement on there, but it sometimes doesn't truly reflect the sort of what it actually is. And obviously using slightly older grain, although as we well know, 12-year-old grain is neither here nor there. I mean, really, grain needs sort of, you know, a lot longer in the cask. But it doesn't. It's got a freshness, but it doesn't. It's not. Oh, it's not too young. Is basically what I'm trying to get at. Okay, so the diluted is a little bit more grain now. The malt seems to have kind of dropped off. I mean, you know, although I mean it's only I say it's only 40%. Actually, that's quite high for a malt content for a blend. Yeah, it's still quite fresh, and like I said, a bit more grain now on the nose. Let's see what that's like. It's a bit more oak on the palate. It's a lot simpler. It's pleasant, a little bit longer. Maybe it's lost a little bit of intensity, but this is where we're kind of like, you know, it's kind of, do you want short and intense, or do you want longer and sort of slightly less intense, I suppose, is where you're at with that one. As a 5-year-old blend, it's okay. It's not too bad.
But swallow the prenup and things seem
Right, okay, so let's move on to the 6-year-old Croftengea. Lomond Funk awaits, I think. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Actually, I'm wrong. It's not as funky as some Lomonds, it has to be said. It's quite cereally. There's a lot of a dry peat. It's actually got some pleasant fruit, chunky toffee, a little bit of milk chocolate. I mean, actually, this is quite clean in relative terms for a Loch Lomond. Like I said, yeah, there is a slight farmyardy note in the background, but you know, I've had funkier Croftengeas, I can tell you that for a start. You know what? I like this. I think this is tempered, shall we say, and it gives you sort of like some of that, you know, iconic sort of Lomond character, but not too much, which, you know, it is kind of cool. So that's right. Bit more oak to start off with, a bit more vanilla and toffee. Peat comes in quite nicely and sort of builds throughout, and it starts to become a little bit more astringent the longer, the more towards the finish you get. It's more phenolic as well than the nose would lead you to believe. On the nose it's got that lovely sort of Highland dryness. On the palate, yeah, like I said, we're getting more phenols, more phenolic notes. Touch of cereal on the mid palate, a little bit masked on the finish, touch of citrus, oak kind of returning. I like that. I think that's really good. It's got lovely progression, and yeah, and not too much funkiness as well. And you know, I love a bit of funky Loch Lomond, but they are really quite difficult to sell, the really weird and wonderful Loch Lomond. So this is kind of like, you know, almost like Loch Lomond light, if you like. There's enough of the Lomond character just to be sort of, you know, Lomond, shall we say, but not too much. Okay, if I'm going to be uber critical, there was a slight soapiness now. I put a little drop of water with it, but you know what? I can live with that. There's a little bit of custard powder, a lot less peat. The peat seems to have vanished, and it's kind of, yeah, there's absolutely no funkiness, no peat at all. A little bit more sweeter barley possibly. So, you know, I would, if you were going to have this, I would say just probably no point in putting any water with it, you know. Anyway, let's see what comes up. A lot less peat. There's that slight astringent note just there on the edges. It's more fuller. There's more oak again, more vanillins. Barley is sweetened. It's got like a sugar coating to it now, and like I said, a lot less peat. I mean, it's not a bad whiskey. Put in a drop of water with it, but I just wouldn't bother. You know, I think sort of, neat, that is absolutely fine. That is a lovely whiskey. It's a lovely Loch Lomond. It's not too Loch Lomond, and I think that's a good selling. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 12-year-old Guyanese rum. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Oh, that's a nice nose, that's good. Quite high-toned, estery, high ester, apricot, green apple, pineapple, tangerine. There's again, biscuity note. This seems to be, is this kind of like, you know, Watt Whisky kind of signature biscuity note. Possibly that burnt biscuity note is coming from the barrel, obviously the whiskey barrel, rather than the, it's not sort of a characteristic I get generally from rum, but again, if you've got maybe a cloudy wort, you're going to get maybe those kind of biscuity notes possibly. There's a little bit of coffee, some vanilla, lime. Stunning. That is really stunning nose. It is a bloody good nose. I don't think this is a cheap bottling, but then independently bottled rum never tends to be particularly cheap. The casks do seem to have a bit of a premium. There's a little desiccated coconut, more vanilla. I mean, that's just a fabulous nose. It really is absolutely fabulous. Let's see what the part's like. Oh, that's lovely. So it kicks off with quite a lot of the barrel character. I'm getting very much a whiskey kind of feeling to start off with. It's got that herbal, rummy kind of character, comes through some vanilla, a little bit of an almost kind of herbal agricole note, some lime juice. Again, it's got not an overt sharpness, but a citric sort of sharpness, a palate cleansing finish. That's obviously the ABV because it is slightly masked. But it's got a lovely high estery kind of character, and that sort of almost kind of a not agave, what am I talking about? That sort of almost kind of agricole kind of note. I mean, maybe this is sugarcane juice, possibly, or maybe this is. I don't get so much sort of like molassy kind of character, and of course, as we know, sort of Diamond does play around with both. Styles of base spirits, shall we say, or you know, that's a lovely nose still. I mean, I can't fault this cask at all. I mean, it really is absolutely spot on. It's kind of proper rum, but not too proper, if you know what I mean. And I know there are a lot of customers that like rum, but don't like it too proper, if you know what I mean. They like the sort of the sweetness, the sweeter dried fruits, the added sugar kind of character, which this doesn't have, it has to be said. There's a little bit more cask influence. I think a lot more vanilla, a softness there now, less kind of funkiness in inverted commas. Oh yeah, but that's still got that sort of slight citric note, tamarind juice. Stunning. I could sniff this all day, but obviously I've got one more to get onto, so let's see what the part's like. Right, so less whiskey cask influence now, and I'm getting more pure rum, sort of more rummy dried fruits, maybe a little bit more vanilla possibly, less agricole sort of characters. I've got a softness, more of a roundedness, what am I talking about? It's more rounder in character, that's better English. Either way, that is absolutely fantastic. That is a stunning rum, it has to be said. Okay, so let's move on to the final rum of this afternoon, the final spirit. This is the 16-year-old Trinidad. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Ooh, that's got some citric character. Intensely citric, lots of sort of lime, lemon, tamarind, unsweetened pineapple. It's taut, it's kind of grapefruit juice. Now I don't remember sort of Angostura being this kind of citric. I remember Angostura being a lot more molassy, a lot more fuller. There's a touch of rose water, which I'm quite surprised about for at 16, but you know, it's there. Even the spices kind of like feel like they're coated in citrus. This really has an intensity. It's lovely. It is a bloody good rum again. A little bit of charred oak. I love the vibrancy of this. I love that sort of citric intensity. It's got just so much character. So pass on. My God, that's insanely good. Again, citric, intensely citric, tight, taut, unsweetened pineapple, lemon, a little bit of melon, sort of, again, unsweetened melon. It's got that citric note is kind of just stopping all that sweetness coming out. There is a little bit of apricot in the middle, and there's a little bit of sweetness creeping through on the mid palate, a bit of vanilla. Again, we've got some slight agricole kind of notes. It's stunning, absolutely stunning. Let's put a little drop of water with it and see what that does. Still quite citric, not much change at all really. So pass on. Touch more mature fruit, less citrus now, rounder, fuller, more vanilla, more rummy dried fruits, sort of fleshier. Again, either way, whichever way you have that, whether you have that neat or with a little drop of water, that is stunning. That's on today's episode of the show. Firstly, a big thank you to Mark from Watt Whisky for samples for today's episode of the show. I think overall, some really good whiskies and good spirits that Mark is bottling. The Speyside, well, I mean, you can't argue. It was very Speyside. Like I said, kind of had that kind of Mortlach-y, Macallan-y kind of sort of American oak aged spirit kind of character. So, you know, if you want to experience that kind of side of things, I think that's not a particularly bad bottling. The Glen Moray, yep, again, okay, not a bad bottling. Really quite surprised once I diluted it on the palate that it became suddenly so tropical, and that was kind of quite a big surprise. But again, you know, not a bad bottling at all. The peat smoke blend, yeah, I mean, it wasn't a bad blend. It was a bit on the youngish side, I suppose, but then it is only sort of 5 years old, relatively speaking. And maybe putting a little drop of water with it wasn't sort of doing it a huge amount of favours, but again, it wasn't too shabby, as they say. I thought the Loch Lomond was really good, really liked that. Again, it was Loch Lomond without too much Loch Lomond character, so, you know, it kind of ticked an awful lot of boxes. I think the two stars of the show had to be the rums. I think the Guyanese rum was just absolutely fantastic. I mean, that was just classic, proper rum, but not too proper, if you like. So it's not going to kind of put off people that kind of like Diplomatico, for example, and all the sort of sweetness that involves. It's a kind of a nice lead in to sort of like proper rums. And the Trinidadian 16-year-old, well, I mean, that was just pretty bloody good, it has to be said. Not cheap. I think that's going for around about 90 something odd pound a bottle. So again, you know, what's a 16-year-old single cask rum, and you have to pay the piper, as they say. But you know, oh, that was bloody good. So, right, so big thank you to Mark for today's episode of the show. Hopefully you think this has again been the usual kind of you know, appraisal, should we say. I think there's some really good things. I think sort of Mark is kind of, you know, pretty much like any other independent bottling company, is bottling some really good stuff. Maybe some stuff that to me is not kind of quite ticking my boxes, it has to be said, but again, I don't think you can argue with the quality of what Mark is bottling. The quality is really good. And it's all about sort of personal taste at the end of the day. But the rums were stunning, absolutely stunning. So all that's left to say basically is I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of the show. Rushing a little bit because I'm kind of running out of time. All that's left to say is good afternoon and good rain.